The Matterhorn, one of the world's most challenging mountains. Unconquered until 150 years ago. In 1865, two rival teams were in a race to the top. British against Italian mountaineers. The triumph of the British turned to tragedy. 4 men fell to their deaths. Descendants of the climbers want to find out what went wrong. Forensic tests provide clues, and there are new sources.
It's outrageous.
Who was to blame? Was it an accident, foul play, or murder? On the border between Italy and Switzerland lies one of the most recognizable mountains in the world. The Matterhorn is a magnet for adventurers, climbers, and tourists. "150 years ago, it remained the last mountain in the Alps that hadn't been conquered. It triggered an unprecedented race to the top. In the early morning of July 13, 1865, 7 mountaineers from Britain, France, and Switzerland gathered in the village of Zermatt to attempt the Matterhorn's first ascent. 36 hours later, 4 of the men were dead.
Morning. Oh, Lord Alfred Douglas. Well, gentlemen, for Queen and country.
For Queen and country.
The leader of the climbing party was the British mountaineer Edward Whymper. The poor son of a London printer became fascinated by the Alps when travelling to Switzerland at the age of 21.
Here was a rather earnest young man, took himself quite seriously, but had huge ambition, was phenomenally fit, and his very first climb was a first ascent. Right from the start, he was making first ascents.
To finance his Alpine tours, Whymper sold drawings of the mountains. He also published books about his travels, including the 1865 catastrophe on the Matterhorn, which he survived. Whymper accused the young English mountaineer Douglas Hadow of causing the accident. Until this day, Douglas Hadow is believed to be at fault.
Something has not been right about this story. For a whole cocktail of reasons, a certain telling of this story has taken a grip, and it has been going on for 150 years. Douglas Hadow has somehow become literally the fall guy for the tragedy that happened on the descent.
Contemporary newspapers provided a different version of events. They accused Whymper of manslaughter, even murder. Was Whymper covering up what really happened on the mountain? In London, an investigation into the true causes of the Matterhorn disaster begins. One of Douglas Hadow's descendants, the Englishman Hadow, wants to solve the mystery. His search begins in the famous English boarding school, Harrow. Penn went to school here, as did his great-great-uncle 90 years earlier. Only one picture of Douglas Hadow can be found. Photography was still in its infancy in the 1860s. But the Hadow name appears in the school register. Documents also reveal that Douglas Hadow was an excellent athlete and team player. After he finished school, young Hadow traveled to Europe. He was enthralled by the Alps. His aim was to climb some of its highest mountains.
My journey is to find out with fresh eyes and deep research, what is it that really went wrong?
The story of one of the most notorious mountain disasters in history was the culmination of decades of adventurism. The 19th century was an age of exploration. The High Alps were the last uncharted territory on the map of Europe. Enterprising British scientists and mountaineers led the way in the exploration of these mountains. They surveyed glaciers, calculated the mountain's age, and climbed unconquered peaks above 13,000 feet. The British founded the world's first Alpine club, whose members often met in Zermatt.
It's a very British thing, this forming clubs. These were the sort of well-to-do upper middle classes. A lot of them were lawyers, judges, schoolmasters, university professors, clergymen, men with respectable professions, by and large.
But the Matterhorn eluded them. According to local legend, monsters roamed its peak. Most mountaineers considered this mountain to be unclimbable.
The Matterhorn
is so difficult because there are no easy ways up or down. Many mountains will at least have one easy way down after a difficult way up.
But at
the Matterhorn, all approaches are difficult. All routes are demanding, including the descent. This can lead to disaster on the way down.
When the Eurasian continental plate collided with the African plate 250 million years ago, the Matterhorn started to grow. The last ice age gave the mountain its current shape and height of 14,691 feet. 150 years ago, climbers considered the Matterhorn's northeastern side to be most difficult. They believed its south face to be less challenging on the Italian side of the mountain. It was here that Whymper appeared on the 12th of July, 1865. 6 times he had tried to climb the Matterhorn, 6 times he had failed. This time he was more determined than ever, but he discovered that his Italian guide Jean-Antoine Carrel was already on his way to climb the Matterhorn without him.
Carrel. Sneaky devil.
Carrel had been enlisted by the Italian Alpine club. They wanted to scale the Matterhorn with an Italian team. It was one of the last 4,000-meter mountains, and they wanted this to be an Italian victory.
It left Whymper stranded without a guide. He later wrote, "I restudied my plans to see if it was not possible to outmaneuver the Italians." Whymper considered tackling the Matterhorn from Zermatt in the northeast. The problem was finding a suitable guide. Then, unexpected, a wealthy young British mountaineer arrived in Breuil. Lord Douglas also wanted to climb the Matterhorn.
Edward Whymper, I suppose. Lord Francis Douglas.
Whymper spotted an opportunity.
You have your porter. There's not much time to lose. We have to beat them Italians.
Oh, very well. Lead the way.
The two men joined forces and headed for Zermatt. On the way was the farm of the Swiss mountain guide Peter Taugwalder, known to Lord Douglas from a recent climb. Taugwalder and his son agreed to join the expedition and climb the Matterhorn from the Swiss side. In the evening, the group reached Zermatt, their base for the ascent of the Matterhorn. Edward Whymper was determined to reach the peak before the Italians. The less experienced Lord Francis Douglas paid for the tour. Old Peter Taugwalder would lead the team to the top. Taugwalder Jr. was quickly promoted from porter to guide. Then, another surprise. A second group of mountaineers arrived in Zermatt. They too wanted to climb the Alps' last unconquered peak in the morning. Charles Hudson was Britain's most famous mountaineer and Whymper's main competitor. Michel Cros from Chamonix in the French Alps would act as a guide. Third in the team was novice Douglas Haddo, who had just climbed Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in the Alps. The competitors decided to join forces to claim the first ascent for Britain. Nobody anticipated the drama that was about to unfold. Least of all, Whymper, who would publish a book about the ascent. To find out what really happened on the Matterhorn, Pen Haddo heads for Zermatt. He has never fully trusted Whymper's account of the mountain's first ascent. Pen is an explorer by profession. In 2003, he made the world's first solo walk to the North Pole from the north coast of Canada.
The reason I have done what I have done as an explorer, indeed the reason I've been an explorer in the first place, is because of the story and the reality of what happened on the Matterhorn in 1865. I took over where Douglas Haddo left off.
Pen has known about the story all his life, but he's never been to Zermatt, the famous village at the foot of the Matterhorn. He heads straight to the center of the village to see the Matterhorn with his own eyes.
Oh my goodness. That's a very serious looking mountain, isn't it? I can totally see why people would think maybe this can never be climbed. It's pretty aggressive.
As the team from Zermatt set off 150 years earlier, climbing conditions were ideal. Whymper and Hudson took turns to lead. The weather was perfect. United by the desire to beat the Italians, the 7 men were making steady progress. Novice Douglas Haddo showed no signs of weakness. On the other side of the mountain, the Italians were taking it easy, unaware of the competition from Zermatt.
They had a mule laden with food supplies, and because times were hard in Italy and the mountain people were poor devils, they probably ate everything before the ascent.
To attempt their final ascents in the early morning, both teams made camp in the afternoon. The British team would use ropes to connect the climbers, a recent innovation in mountaineering. The team carried a light sash cord used during previous climbs. A second rope was made of manila. It was harder to handle. The team's greatest pride was a strong new rope specially manufactured for the Alpine Club to provide maximum safety in the mountains. The club rope consisted of 3 pieces of manila. A red thread was the mark of the Alpine Club. To prevent the rope from breaking during a fall, it was designed to be both strong and flexible. The 3 ropes would play a key role in the unfolding drama. It was the 14th of July, 1865, the day of reckoning. After dawn, both teams began their final ascent. The weather remained perfect. So far, the British climb had been surprisingly easy. But how would the team function under pressure?
The way that the team was assembled, it feels as though it had been done in great haste. It seems that everybody was putting himself first rather than the group as a whole. There is great danger in this. At any time, such a team can fall apart.
Suddenly, the ascent was getting steep. Nobody had ever been this high on the northeasterly ridge. But there was little time for rest. The thought of the Italians kept everyone in the British team going. The team from Roy were making headway. The Italians were confident that they would reach the peak by the afternoon. To trace the route of the historic race, the Swiss mountain guide and historian Hermann Biener guides Penhedo to the slopes of the Hohlicht mountain. It lies opposite the Matterhorn's north face. Hermann Biener knows the story of the first ascent from the historical literature and through the region's oral history. Penn wants to know how the increasingly difficult terrain was affecting the team and his great-great-uncle.
Penhedo was in excellent shape, and no wonder if you're 18, 19-year-old, very sporty, and it seems that he didn't see any danger. It's incredible. It's incredible if you are climbing the first time in your life and suddenly you are in the north face of the Matterhorn.
Where no one's ever been before.
I will not do that, never.
No, this is the teenage mind at work, I think.
That's the teenage. You don't never die. I don't die.
Until now, the 7 climbers had been climbing without rope.
Up to what we now call the shoulder on the Hernley Ridge, it was all fairly straightforward. I don't think it's actually that easy. You can still fall and die there. It's not that straightforward, but it's comparatively easy. Then suddenly on this final section where the ridge rears up almost perpendicular, it suddenly is a whole different game.
It was time to rope up. Today, mountaineers will climb in groups of 2 or 3 and attach themselves to the rock face. In the 1860s, climbing techniques were less sophisticated. All 7 men connected with one rope and without anchor. If one climber fell, the others would save him with a new club rope.
Climbing in those days was very different. This is how I would approach the Hernley Ridge or the Matterhorn today. I have a harness, I have my carbines, I have my helmet, and there is a huge difference in the boots. At the time, these hobnailed boots were standard to get a grip on the ice. The disadvantage, it's very slippery on rock. Today we have crampons, which you attach to your boots. A lot has happened since then when it comes to safety.
Da hat sich unglaublich viel in Sachen Sicherheit eben getan.
Not only the inexperienced Douglas Haddo must have been overwhelmed by the Matterhorn. Whymper and the mountain guides were also pushed to their limits.
Thinking that the ridge itself is just too steep and difficult, they traverse out onto the north face. And I've been there. It's awesome, actually. You suddenly you're over this immense precipice. Everything's dropping away. It's a huge, great abyss. It's the kind of terrain which is not actually particularly difficult, but it's rock with snow and ice. Some of the rock is a bit loose. It's a kind of sort of uncertain, insubstantial terrain to be moving on, and you're very conscious, that one slip could be fatal.
The Matterhorn's north face is one of the toughest climbing terrains in the Alps. But the thought of the Italian competitors kept driving the British team further up the mountain, across rock and ice. For the less experienced climbers like Heddo and Lord Douglas, the ascent was turning into an ordeal. But nobody considered turning back. One team, one rope. Krogh and Whymper at the front. Suddenly, the team reached the top of the precipice. The slopes on the Matterhorn's roof turned out to be gentler than expected. The peak was in reach, but the team was too slow for Whymper.
You can imagine Whymper, this ambitious young man with a lot of experience, and perhaps feeling he'd been held back and it'd been too slow. And finally, here was this summit of his dreams in view. Suddenly he thinks, oh, to hell with it, I'm bored with waiting. I want to get ahead. And somehow he manages to untie, slips off the loop of rope and just runs ahead to be first on the summit, just out of sheer impatience.
Whymper's action would have astounded his fellow climbers.
It's bad behaving to take a rope off and run as first on the top, you know. And I'm sure the other British gentlemen were aristocrats. I'm sure they would never have done that, and they didn't do it, you know.
Closely pursued by Krogh, Whymper was racing to the top. The rest of the Zermatt team was falling behind. It was Whymper's 7th attempt to climb the Matterhorn. This time he made it, ahead of Krogh, ahead of the Italians. It was the greatest achievement of Whymper's career.
The idea of being the first person or the first people to reach this particular apparently inaccessible spot is very thrilling. Just what a sense of relief. Oh, thank God, Carol is still down there. He didn't make it before us. Huge sense of relief. Then that relief turns to this sort of embarrassing triumphalism when he starts shouting down to alert Carol to the fact that they got there first.
Ah! Italians!
And then when Carol doesn't notice, they start hurling rocks down just to make quite sure that the Italians have got the message.
Italians! I beat you!
It's not the most edifying chapter in the history of British mountaineering.
Eventually, the rest of the British climbing party team reached the peak. It was a triumph, not only for Whymper, but for the entire team. History had been made.
The great thing about first ascents is that they last forever. It's not like other sports where world records are improved, somebody runs faster. The first ascent remains. If I open my little book, it says Whymper and his teammates were the first to climb the Matterhorn.
It was a victory not just of individuals, but also of the Swiss village of Zermatt. But how had Whymper's sudden sprint to the top affected the solidarity of the team as it faced the descent? It is said that Krogh, Heddo, Hudson and Douglas started the descent without Whymper. Whymper lingered to make a sketch and record his moment of triumph. A descent is often far more dangerous than the ascent. Yet at this moment of peril, the team appeared divided. To maintain unity, the old Taugwalder followed the leading group. Eventually, Whymper and Taugwalder Jr. also departed. The team continued in separate groups. Krogh, Heddo, Hudson and Lord Douglas were heading for the precipice. Then Taugwalder caught up. When he reached the group of four, he connected to Lord Douglas, using the satch cord he'd been carrying all day. He waited until Whymper and Taugwalder Jr. reached the team. It was their turn to connect to old Taugwalder using the club rope. At last, all 7 men were reconnected.
All good?
Yes, it's good.
Onwards!
The group headed for the precipice below the Matterhorn's roof. Yet very little time had been spent planning the team's descent.
You know how terrifying that particular section is, and no one's suggesting, why didn't we use one of the very few rocks that do stick out as an anchor point and just have a rope hanging off it that we can use for hands and security? It's very strange, this.
They had this discussion, it seems, but then they stopped the discussion without taking a decision.
Lord Douglas was clearly struggling, as was Haddo. At every step, Gros carefully positioned Haddo's feet. The first 4 now reached a section that was difficult to see from above. It was 3:10 in the afternoon. Gros, Haddo, Hudson and Lord Douglas disappeared down the mountain.
Hudson! Douglas! Douglas! Gros! Hudson!
Because the rope between Taugwalder and Lord Douglas had broken, the other 3 survived.
It goes so quick in the mountains, I tell you. 5 seconds earlier, you had strong men, happy men, teenagers, thinking that they were famous now. They have done the Matterhorn. 5 seconds later, they're just there. They disappear.
This terrible vision of these horrified faces as they slide down and then disappear. And then 3 men are left. And according to Whymper, they're almost paralyzed. They hardly move. For 30 minutes, they just stand there, just trembling with shock.
I once saw with my own eyes how someone fell to his death. To begin with, you hope that somehow things are still going to be okay. Of course, you can't see where their fall has ended. So, right until the end, you hope that, although they may have been badly injured, they somehow survived. But then you have to remain focused and continue your descent, which doesn't exactly make things easier.
Exactly how the 3 survivors managed to climb down the mountain remains unclear. Somehow, they overcame their paralysis, descending very slowly. They spent the night in the rock face without blankets. After sunrise, the men eventually cleared their old camp. In the late morning, they reached the valley, devastated. Between Whymper and Taugwalder, all communication had broken down.
Whymper didn't have a good communication with the guides, never, even maybe only with Cross, but all the other guides were a little bit nothing to him, and I don't know. But the Taugwalders didn't talk English, and Whymper, of course, didn't understand this dialect. And in the end, there are 2 stories for the way down.
Whymper accused the Taugwalders of crying like children after disaster had struck. The Taugwalders said the same of Whymper. Shocked, the people in the valley wondered what had happened on the mountain. A team of mountaineers was dispatched to recover the bodies, 4,500 feet below the peak. Pen Hadow decides to visit the location where his great-great-uncle's life came to a premature end. For 150 years there have been rumors about the disaster. Pen wants to discover what really happened.
We are here on the bottom of the north face, and we are more or less in the direct line from the top, and so they fell down 1,000 meters, the whole north face, and in the end you see this overhanging part here. It was some 100 meters free fall, and they just landed here.
What I'm most struck by is the sheer grisliness of what is found here. That's what keeps going round and round in my mind. That they did not discover whole bodies. It was very much body parts. People were being identified by shirt or trouser or belt. And so remains came pouring off this lip, really splattered on the snow. It is truly a ghastly end to what was so nearly a quite remarkable achievement.
Pictures of the Matterhorn's first ascent would go around the world. Whymper documented his own triumph. The French artist Doré's depiction of the catastrophe drew large crowds in Paris. In Britain, the public was shocked.
The ascent of the Matterhorn really marks the end of what we like to call the golden age of Alpine mountaineering. Up till that point, there hadn't been many accidents. And then suddenly there was this terrible, shocking, horrific accident, which suddenly appalled the British public to the extent that Queen Victoria apparently said, can we not ban this mountaineering? Can we not stop these people doing this crazy pursuit?
In a Zermatt hotel, a court of inquiry was set up. The acting judge, a hotel owner friendly with British tourists and mountaineers. Whymper was the first to give evidence.
It was about 300 feet from the summit. Mr. Hadow experienced considerable difficulty coming down. Mr. Crow had helped by planting his feet in a rock hold. He then went to turn to go down himself when Mr. Hadow slipped. Mr. Hadow's fall also took down Mr. Crow, Mr. Hudson, and after him, Lord Douglas. The few instants that this lasted afforded sufficient time for the three at the rear to plant themselves firmly. So firmly indeed that the rope broke between Lord Douglas and Taugwalder father.
Merci.
Taugwalder Sr. was up next. His evidence differed from Whymper's.
Fester zu stehen, habe ich mich gegen
To stand firm, Taugwalder turned towards the rock face. Because the rope behind him wasn't taut, he wrapped it around a rock, a life-saving anchor. Taugwalder was convinced that if the rope between him and Lord Douglas hadn't snapped, he, together with Crow, could have saved the climbers.
Das Seil zwischen Lord Douglas und mir nicht gerissen wäre, ich mit Führer Crow die Herren hätte retten können.
Taugwalder blamed the weakness of the rope for the accident, whereas Whymper blamed Hadow's inexperience. The Court of Inquiry agreed with Whymper. It publicly declared that Hadow caused the accident and that nobody could be blamed for any criminal behavior. The court proceedings remained classified for the next 60 years. Soon speculation about the disaster abounded. Whymper came under suspicion. Rumours about the disaster spread as far as Austria. The Viennese paper Neue Freie Presse reported exclusively about the case. The paper claimed that the rope didn't break. After their fall, the 4 climbers were dangling in empty space, held by Taugwalder. The paper wrote, then, as Taugwalder was losing his strength, the rope broke. Or did a knife brought into play behind Taugwalder's back cut the rope? It may be that the cut was a mere amputation, severing what had already been earmarked for death and saving those who were still standing. Yet this was a dreadful act. Trying to justify it for your own conscience must drive you to insanity. Whymper arrived in the town of Interlaken. People who knew him described him as deeply disturbed and mentally unhinged.
What would a lawyer say if someone had cut the rope with a knife? We are approaching intentional homicide or murder in the eyes of the local Swiss penal code. This would have required a substantial penalty. Had the crime been committed intentionally, for which we don't have any proof, it would have been first-degree murder, to be punished by death.
The accusation hung over Whymper like a black cloud. 6 years after the disaster, Whymper published a book about the Matterhorn's first ascent that provided his version of events. Whymper reminded readers that the rope that broke between Taugwalder and Lord Douglas wasn't the club rope, but the weak sash cord. The historic rope is on display in a museum in Zermatt. To establish how strong the disaster rope really was, an exact replica is being tested in a Swiss rope factory. The rope is attached and stretched. It breaks under a weight of 300 kilograms, 660 pounds. When the 4 mountaineers fell in 1865, no cut may have been required. The rope was so thin, it had to break. So why did Taugwalder choose the thin rope, not the club rope, 4 times as strong, to attach himself to Lord Douglas? Whymper believed that the old guide had deliberately used the weak rope to protect himself against a fall by those in front. Whymper wrote, there remains, however, the suspicious fact that the rope which broke was the thinnest and the weakest one that we had. If, on the other hand, Taugwalder thought that an accident was likely to happen, it was to his interest to have the weaker rope where it was placed. In his book, Whymper had accused Taugwalder of malice or culpable homicide.
Today we would call it defamation. As a human being, he was demoralized and mentally destroyed. For the rest of his life, he never really got over Whymper's statement.
Until recently, Taugwalder's choice of the thin rope was never fully explained. But there is a new lead. In England, in the university city of Oxford. At the world-famous Bodleian Library, Pen Haddow discovers a new source. It promises to shed fresh light on the entire story. Pen discovers a book written on the centenary of the Matterhorn's first ascent by a famous Alpine club member and pioneer of alpine skiing. The author believes the rope was cut, not on the way down, but on the way up. A completely new hypothesis, backed up by other Alpine club members.
Actually, the rope was cut. What a horrid fellow he was. And so perhaps it is right to to let the cut rope story see the light of day.
Under scrutiny is the moment when the peak first came into reach.
Crows and Whymper were so excited that they detached themselves from the rope.
Actually, if you're moving up a mountain, to get that knot loose and then to slip out of it and then overtake someone is actually quite difficult.
Whymper reportedly confessed to a famous novelist just how he detached himself.
Whymper, after a good dinner, remarked to Mason, "Thinking it over, I believe that I did cut the rope behind me, so that I could more easily race crows to the top."
That's how he initiated the entire tragedy, to a degree. Because the rope was cut, it had to be mended on the way down with a thin makeshift rope, which in the end wasn't strong enough. And that's how the tragedy took its course.
After Whymper's reported cut on the way up, the strong club rope consisted of two pieces. One piece was used by the four in front, the other by those catching up. Because not enough strong club rope was left to connect the two groups, Taugwalder had to use the thin sash cord instead.
Whymper makes explicit statements that imply that his guides had somehow caused the accident by ineptitude or worse, deliberately picking a weak rope so that they were protecting themselves. If there was an accident, they'd be all right. And now we discover that it was Whymper that cut the rope on the way up so that he could be first. If you think about it, it's outrageous.
Denying any responsibility for the accident, Whymper never wrote about cutting the rope, accusing Taugwalder of malice instead.
Whymper writes a best-selling book that is read around the world that promotes him as the great leader and mountaineer. It's frankly shoddy at best from a leader who survives and gets to tell the story his way.
Until the end of his life, Whymper's accusations left a stain on Taugwalder's reputation. Probably illiterate, the old guide couldn't defend himself. He temporarily migrated to North America, then returned. At the age of 68, he died a broken man at the foot of the Matterhorn. Only after his death, Taugwalder's reputation could be restored. Next to Taugwalder is the grave of some of the victims. The tombstone bears the names of Crow, Lord Douglas, Hudson and Haddo. To find out what caused the fall of the four climbers, Penn meets mountain guide Benedict Perrin, a direct descendant of the Taugwalders. They visit the Zermatt Museum, where the famous rope that broke is on display. There's also the club rope that was used during the climb. Can the boots found on the bodies provide clues? Haddo's boot looks particularly flimsy.
If you look to this boot, you see the nails below, you know, on the sole.
Yeah.
And the one from Haddo, you see they are almost no nail.
Yeah.
Completely different kind of boot, you know. One is a real mountaineering boot where you can tie it, and you have nails on the sole. And the other one is more or less a boot to go to the church on Sunday morning, you know. So you can imagine to climb on ice with a boot like that. It's almost impossible.
I mean, it's sort of insane, to use the modern parlance. It's unbelievable. You're standing on a bar of soap. That's what you're doing. On ice. What do you think's going to happen?
To get a clear idea of the moment of the accident, Penn decides to make his way to the top of the Matterhorn. Benedict Perrin knows this mountain like the back of his hand.
And that's where the accident has happened, you know? Just here. Yeah, just over there.
Based on oral tradition dating back to the accident, Benedict knows exactly where tragedy struck. For 15 years after the tragedy, a piece of rope remained visible, attached by Whymper and his guides to help them down the mountain after the disaster, attached to the very rock that had served as an anchor for Taugwalter and the other 2 survivors.
We're one step away from where the slip that caused the fatal accident happened. First Crows, then Haddo, then Hudson, and then Lord Douglas go down this line. Taugwalter hears the shout from Crows. Ah! He looks up, maybe, sees a limb going, grabs the rope down like this. Oh, he's pulled down like this. And they've gone. That's it. This fast.
Haddo's slip may have caused the accident, but was the disaster Haddo's fault?
To say it's his fault is ludicrous. Any one of them could have slipped. Anyone can slip on a mountain. You don't have to be inexperienced to make a mistake. And here was this sort of hastily convened non-team, elated, perhaps losing concentration on a difficult descent.
It was a collective failure of the team. They should have taken much greater care of the least experienced climber, who would have lost his strength by now. It's the duty of the others to look out for him. They should have worked together, then nothing of this would have happened in the first place.
They were all out of their comfort zone, out of their experience zone. Of course they were doing their best, or they knew they were going to die. They did their best, and it wasn't good enough, and that's life and that's death in the mountains.
Until today, the Matterhorn's first ascent remains a symbol of humanity's triumph over nature. It's still a magnet for mountaineers from around the world.